I'm Sarah De Carvalho, CEO of It's a Penalty, and thank you all for joining this panel discussion today. In celebration of Commonwealth Week, we're really delighted to be joined by representatives from Commonwealth accredited organisations and the Commonwealth Secretariat. And over the next 60 minutes, we will be exploring the importance of the Commonwealth in protecting children from sexual exploitation and abuse. But before we get started, I want to make a quick announcement that next month, on the 20th of April, we will be launching our CommonProtect research report, which looks at the legal systems protecting children from sexual exploitation and abuse in 21 Commonwealth countries. This has been undertaken in partnership with the Commonwealth Lawyers Association and a range of other partners, including the Thomson Reuters Foundation, CMS, Clayton UTZ, and SISDOC. The findings of the Commonwealth report show that there is still a long way to go towards ensuring every child in the Commonwealth is protected, and that offenders are prosecuted and that survivors have access to justice. And to make sure that you receive a copy of this report and can attend the launch panel event on the 20th of April, please visit itsapenalty.org and sign up to our mailing list now. So the reason we're all here today is because we believe that children all over the Commonwealth deserve to be protected from sexual exploitation and abuse. Estimates show that worldwide, 1 in 8 children are sexually exploited or abused before the age of 18. And globally, 1/3 of detected human trafficking survivors are children. These forms of violence are a threat from which no child, community, or country is immune. As with all areas of the world, this is a growing concern throughout the Commonwealth. The pandemic has seen rates of online abuse skyrocket, and associated economic fallout has placed many children at greater risk of exploitation. Recent climate-related disasters and conflict have caused millions of children to be displaced, increasing their vulnerability to sexual violence, and the time to act is now. The Commonwealth, as well as its accredited and organisations and civil society, has an important role to play in protecting children from sexual exploitation and abuse. Comprised of 54 countries spread across all regions of the world, the Commonwealth is a significant and diverse association. All member states and the Commonwealth's wide-ranging network of accredited organisations are united by shared values and principles as enshrined in the Commonwealth Charter. Every child in the Commonwealth has the right to be protected from violence. All member states are party to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and have committed to ending child sexual exploitation and abuse by 2030 through the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Despite these commitments and progress made, we know that there are still several gaps in the law and protection systems in many Commonwealth countries. Perpetrators of child sexual exploitation and abuse often act with impunity. The Commonwealth's shared history and common law tradition mean that many member states face similar challenges in addressing these forms of violence against children. The Commonwealth is uniquely placed to serve as a catalyst for cooperation and common action. It can work better to protect children, to CommonProtect. So during Commonwealth Week, we want to kickstart a conversation and explore the potential for that joint action. And so now I'm honoured to introduce our panellists who join me today. Brian Spears, President of the Commonwealth Lawyers Association. Welcome, Brian.
Hi, Sarah. Lovely to be here.
Dr. Shavana Thornthwaite, Head of Human Rights at the Commonwealth Secretariat. Welcome, Shavana.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Really honoured to be here too.
Stephen Twigg, Secretary General of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I look forward to the discussion.
Dr. David Jones, board member for the Commonwealth Organisation for Social Work. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Sarah, and I bring apologies from my colleague Godfred, who had hoped to take part but is not well. So this is an important event. We're pleased to be here.
Well, we're delighted that you're here in his place, and please send him our best wishes. And Sneh Aurora, Director of the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative from the London office. Welcome, Sneh.
Thanks, Sarah. So pleased to be here.
And finally, Helen Jones, Commonwealth Advocacy Advisor for It's a Penalty. Welcome, Helen.
Thank you, Sarah. Delighted to be here today.
So over the next 60 minutes, our goals are we've got 3 goals. Firstly, to draw attention to the Commonwealth-wide issue of child sexual exploitation and abuse, and then to discuss what collective action the Commonwealth can take to better protect children from these forms of violence. And finally, to make recommendations for a call to action ahead of the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting later this year. So now let's hear from our panelists. Brian, in many countries, laws are the foundation upon which all child protection efforts are placed. In your opinion, what role can the law and law reform throughout the Commonwealth play in guaranteeing children's protection from sexual exploitation and abuse and ensuring their access to justice?
Thank you, Sarah. And again, it's a great honour to be here and for the Commonwealth Lawyers Association to have partnered up with your amazing organisation. And I look forward to the official launch of the report in April.
Thank
You
you.
in your introductory remarks that we are all connected in the Commonwealth by mostly a shared common law history and a shared language. And these connections, given that the Commonwealth accounts for nearly 1/3 of the world's population, I think give the Commonwealth a real advantage. The networks are in place, the connections are there, and we ought to use all of those to assist in trying to meet the goals that you have identified of eliminating abuse and violence towards children. Given that we have 1/3 of the world's population, disappointingly, around 60% of all child marriages occur in the Commonwealth. In 10 Commonwealth countries, there is no minimum age at which children can get married. And in all Commonwealth countries, as you have said, we have signed up to various international conventions and treaties and pledges. So what can the law do? The law can hold to account those whose job it is to enforce the law. They can lobby for constitutional change and reform, and they can make sure that at meetings such as the Heads of Government meeting or the Law Ministers meeting of Commonwealth Law Ministers, both of which the Commonwealth lawyers will attend and will hope to take part in some small way, that by having the discussion advanced at that high level, I think the legal community can assist in having the discussion that you so eloquently describe we are now starting urgently. Of course, it should not require law and legislation to protect children. In common law jurisdictions, the common law will provide a measure of protection. But as I've been looking into this issue, one can see that definitions of what is a child are not uniform. One can see that there needs to be extraterritorial cooperation as people travel from one jurisdiction to another and travel home again, often having committed abuse while they have been in that other destination. So what the law can do is seek to harmonize some definitions to ensure that boys are included and it's not all just abuse of girls, and can look at questions of extraterritorial cooperation. That should surely be possible in a commonwealth of nations with a common language, a common law, and a common purpose towards common protection of our children.
Thank you very much. That is so encouraging. Like you said, to have the legal community assist in this will just make a huge difference. And we're so grateful to have you on this panel, and we look forward to hearing from you later. Shavana, to what extent is a Commonwealth-wide approach required in order to tackle child sexual exploitation and abuse?
Thank you, Sarah. And also, I just echo the words of my fellow panelists. Really honoured to be here and talk about this really important issue. And I think the question that you have asked is also a pretty complex one. So I'm going to try and sort of answer it as best I can in the time that I have. Child sexual exploitation and abuse, without a doubt, is widespread across the world. And I think, and many will agree with me, that it rears its head and is really prevalent within the Commonwealth as well. So when we think about a Commonwealth-wide approach, we can look to things, and you mentioned this earlier, the Commonwealth Charter, where countries have already endorsed the protection of human rights, of course in a pretty general way, but that would include the rights of the child, and be part and parcel of that. The Charter enshrines the values and aspirations that unite the Commonwealth and expresses the commitment of member states to improve the lives of all people within the Commonwealth. So this sort of consensus-built approach, I believe, can also be done for child sexual exploitation and abuse more specifically. Now, I think there are also Commonwealth-wide convergences and trends that allow us to gain insight into certain child-related exploitative practices, behaviours and risk factors. So this, alongside the fact that these sorts of practices can be very transnational across Commonwealth borders, not just simply within them, means commitment and cooperation between Commonwealth member countries is in fact essential to address the issue effectively. So a Commonwealth-wide approach would allow, I think in the first instance, collective momentum and buy-in to address the issues, but also knowledge and data sharing between governments and public agencies, which is invaluable. With this issue, I always remember a phrase that I sort of like to kind of reiterate now and again, and it's that it takes a network to defeat a network. And I think this is no less truer than here, where there is real value in Commonwealth countries coming together and perhaps even designing a sort of a template, for lack of a better word, to address the issue. Now, I just want to put a disclaimer on everything I've just said. I think a Commonwealth-wide approach is really essential, but I also think it's not the entire solution. So what we need to also emphasise alongside the Commonwealth-wide approach is that this kind of approach needs to be married with the awareness that child exploitation is really, really contextual and sometimes quite unique to a particular country or region. For example, whilst harmful traditional practices, gender norms, stigma, religion, to name a few things, are broad categories evident within the Commonwealth and connected to child exploitation, they will also be very, very nuanced in their existence. And a broad approach would absolutely have to be combined with a very contextual methodology reflecting the specific context of the exploitation at hand.
Thank you so much. Wonderful insights. Thank you so much, Shavana. We look forward to chatting later. Stephen, the protection of children is a hugely important issue and close to many people's hearts. So with your expertise, how can parliamentarians across the Commonwealth champion children's rights to be protected from sexual exploitation and abuse?
Sarah, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to join this important panel discussion today. I think my answer to this is perhaps to break down the different functions that parliamentarians have. So there's legislation, there's the oversight and financial side, the budget, and then there's the broader championing role, including at a local constituency level. So clearly legislation is crucial. And Brian gave the example of child marriage, and there are many other areas where legislation within a jurisdiction is of vital importance. Secondly, there are international conventions on the rights of the child, for example, to which governments need to sign up. And one of the roles of parliaments is to oversee and challenge and scrutinise governments about those commitments. And very importantly, there is also the budget making role that the Parliament has, ensuring the resources are there so that any legislation that is made or commitments that are made internationally can actually be implemented on the ground. And thirdly, there is the broader role of the parliamentarian as a champion, particularly at a local level. And I think that a member of parliament who has a constituency can be a really important voice, but also a really important ear to listen to those that are coming forward with regard to issues relating to sexual exploitation and abuse. And I think engaging with children and young people, whistleblowers, survivors and victims is a very important part of this process. Now, first and foremost, this is within one's own jurisdiction, within the country or parliament that you're in. But there is an international responsibility here as well, as others have said. And my previous role chairing the International Development Select Committee, we looked at this question of sexual exploitation and abuse in the international development sector. And there are some really important lessons from that. Some of the things have been touched upon already by the previous speakers in terms of extraterritorial jurisdiction, data sharing and so forth, that parliamentarians I think should be taking an interest in, as well as their domestic responsibility. I would say my big answer to this question is that laws matter, resources matter, international conventions matter, but at least of equal importance is culture and a commitment to really making a difference as parliamentarians in terms of both challenging government but also speaking up for constituents. Because in the end, sexual exploitation and abuse is about power, and it's about the abuse of power, and an important role for parliamentarians is to empower those who haven't traditionally had their voices heard.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you for your insights. David, as we all know, there are many components making up the system to protect children from these forms of violence, with the law just being one of them. What is social work, and what role do social workers across the Commonwealth play in protecting children and supporting survivors?
It's a very good question, Sarah, because social work is understood differently across the Commonwealth in different places, although there is a common core. Increasingly, social work is seen as a profession. In some parts of the world, you have to have a master's degree, or there are doctorates that people can pursue. But in other parts of the world, particularly across Asia, social work is understood as voluntary work, anything that anybody can do that improves their local community and society. So, for example, I've seen in Indian newspapers announcements that there will be a community social work on Saturday to clear the litter and improve the environment of the village. So we have to understand that people see social work in these very different ways. And many people say, well, this is only about ordinary relationships. Don't we all do that? And can't we all do it? But in this context, social work has a very specific contribution, because very often social workers are the people who have to get alongside the child or the young person to listen to their experience, to talk with the family, and to assess where it is safest for that child or young person to live and stay. And that's a very controversial role. As we know, all across the Commonwealth, there are debates. Sometimes social workers are criticised for intervening too strongly and breaking up families. And social workers are also criticised for being too naive and not seeing the real risks that children and young people face. So in this context, social workers are key professionals working with law enforcement very often, working with families. They can be employed in public organisations, but they also work in the NGO voluntary sector. And in many parts of Africa, social workers are involved in core social development, food security, and the very basics of human life. But whatever role they're doing, social workers are in contact with families, are in contact with young people, and are the eyes and ears of the community. and also sometimes the authoritative response of the community to protect children and young people. We don't always get it right. It's really difficult and challenging work. It requires intellect and it requires empathy, but social workers are key partners in working to protect young people and to improve the environment in which young people grow up. I hope that made some sense, Sarah, to look at how social workers contribute.
No, completely. And, amazing. Social work is such a vital part of the child protection system. So thank you so much for sharing. Sneh, of course, we know that child sexual exploitation and abuse takes many forms, but how is the issue of child exploitation viewed using the lens of contemporary forms of slavery and existing international legal frameworks, including the UN Sustainable Development Goals?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And again, thank you so much for inviting CHRI to contribute to this panel and very important discussion. As you mentioned at the outset, every child in the Commonwealth has the right to be protected from all forms of violence. And this right is enshrined in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Now, this convention urges states to take appropriate measures to protect children from all forms of exploitation. And this includes measures such as legislative, administrative, social, and educational. This Child Rights Convention has been ratified by all 54 Commonwealth states, and globally, only the United States has not yet ratified this landmark framework. Another international framework that you mentioned and others have mentioned here is that of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Now, under the SDGs, all countries have made commitments to end violence against children. SDG target 16.2 calls explicitly for the elimination of violence against children. SDG target 5.3 addresses specific forms of violence and harm, such as child marriage and female genital mutilation. And SDG target 8.7 urges states to take effective and immediate measures to eradicate forced labor, modern slavery, and human trafficking. And this includes the eradication of sexual exploitation of children, child marriage, child labor, and the recruitment and use of children in armed conflict. Now, there are other international and as well as regional human rights instruments that provide a legal framework to guide states to fulfill their obligations around child rights and protection. For example, at the regional level, Commonwealth governments can also accede to the Lanzarote Convention, and this is the Council of Europe Convention on the Protection of Children Against Sexual Exploitation and Sexual Abuse. This is a regional benchmark for legislation and policies relating to prosecution of such offenses and to protect children. And happy to report that the UK, Malta, and Cyprus are already a party to this convention. As well as these international conventions and regional frameworks, the United Nations has also set up a special human rights body to address this issue. The Special Rapporteur on the Sale and Exploitation of Children is an independent expert whose mandate has an exclusive focus on children. And this includes the sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography. And this Special Rapporteur has the mandate to gather and analyze information globally, conduct research, identify root causes, share best practices, promote prevention strategies, but also make recommendations to protect and promote the rights of children, including in connection with their rehabilitation. The Special Rapporteur recently published her report that laid out a practical approach to addressing the sale and sexual exploitation of children. And if it's possible, I can share the link to that report in the chat in case it's visible to others. Now, also intergovernmental agencies have also contributed. UNICEF published a paper that outlines a legal framework for combating the exploitation of children. UNICEF's Innocenti Research Center works in close collaboration with individual and civil society experts in this area. Globally, it's estimated that 40.3 million people live in modern slavery, and that 1 in every 4 are children. So governments must thus increase their commitment to address sexual child exploitation in order to meet their international obligations and to achieve SDG target 8.7, but also the other SDG targets and under the international and regional conventions and frameworks. They can do so by supporting child survivors of modern slavery through the provision of services specifically tailored to children. And states must criminalize the exploitation of children and tailor court processes to the needs of children as well. And finally, states must take steps to address the underlying risk factors associated with the exploitation of children.
Thank you, Sneh. It really is by coming together and working together that we're really going to make a difference. We really look forward to hearing more from you in a moment. Helen, the Commonwealth itself has many key mechanisms and moments that can be used to focus and advance progress on certain important issues. How in particular can the upcoming Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, CHOGM, serve as a springboard for protecting children from sexual exploitation and abuse throughout the Commonwealth?
Yes, now, thank you, Sarah, for that. So CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, I mean, what is it? It's a bizarre acronym, isn't it? But basically, it's the major political meeting of all the member governments of the Commonwealth that takes place every 2 years. And at that meeting, heads will decide on what are the joint areas that Commonwealth members can work together going forward for the next 2 years. So as the political meeting for the Commonwealth, it's actually very important for those of us that have got particular messages, particular advocacy strategies to try and target it. And CHOGM this coming year is going to be meeting in June in Kigali in Rwanda. So we're looking ahead to that at It's a Penalty with our strategy for that moment. And this Commonwealth conversation that we're beginning now is part of that overall strategy. So we need to get the issue onto the table. And the first part of that is obviously creating the evidence base. So what is the basis upon which we're saying that there is a problem in the Commonwealth in terms of child exploitation and abuse? And as you've already said at the beginning of this webinar, we've got a publication coming out next month, which is basically, it's been mapping the legal frameworks of 21 Commonwealth countries. We've started with 21, and also identifying what are the particular issues that Commonwealth countries are facing. So drawing on that evidence base, we'll begin to pull together some key messages that we want to take to heads about the issue in the Commonwealth. And then what we're also doing, and through this kickstart through Commonwealth Week, is we're wanting to start a Commonwealth conversation. Now, the Commonwealth has a deep network of Commonwealth accredited organisations and civil society networks and professional associations all over the Commonwealth. And it's absolutely essential that we harness that debate within Commonwealth organisations and within country as well, to begin to really have, as I say, a conversation about the issues that affect individual countries, but also what are the commonalities? What are the areas for common action that we can look at together? And through that Commonwealth conversation and discussion, I think what's essential is we begin to frame what we're calling a Commonwealth call to action, and that will draw on those commonalities. And then there are, as you said, not only the heads of government meeting, but there are other platforms in the Commonwealth that we can also use. And an essential one is also going to be the law ministers meeting. There's also a meeting of human rights in Geneva. And I think we'll want to be looking at all of those platforms to use going forward. So I think that's the overall strategy, and that's the overall openings that we can use in the Commonwealth going forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Helen. Taking this into consideration, Brian, what more do you feel can be done in the Commonwealth to legally protect children from sexual exploitation and abuse?
I'm finding the panel comment, Sarah, really inspiring, because it's drawing together all of the complex strands of this particular issue, but there is already being demonstrated great expertise, insight, and care. It reminds me a little of some work I do in an area of law that I'm interested, which is dispute resolution through mediation. And sometimes when describing mediation, I use the phrase, it's like having a difficult conversation with people. And difficult conversations need to be had in this area. Shavana has highlighted the need for individual country contextualization, but I think that's just another difficult conversation. David is mentioning sensitivity and the very carefully calibrated decisions of the social workers. And again, those are difficult conversations. And with the parliamentarians, we need to have enough space to have them face into difficult conversations. So I'm greatly encouraged by the concept of starting this conversation. And you know that the Commonwealth Lawyers Association will very much want to be part and to assist. Specifically, organizations need to move this up their priority agenda. We in the CLA will need to have people identified to be the torchbearers and leaders who can comment with authority and influence on this topic in the conversations which I hope will occur. I do have a list of rather specific and slightly boring legal definitions, and I don't think this is quite the place for saying, wouldn't it be nice if we could have harmonized definitions of what is a child, what is grooming, what is trafficking, what does online abuse mean, and what does extraterritorial cooperation mean? All of those are building blocks and ingredients to making a difference. But what is really required is what I think Stephen referred to. It's a hearts and minds, it's a prioritizing, it's a cultural facing into our problems. And it's not just places elsewhere. I'm speaking to you from Belfast in Northern Ireland, where only last week we had a public apology issued to the victims of historical sexual abuse in children's homes, often run by religious charities and organizations. This is not something happening elsewhere, it is something happening everywhere. And we need to become passionate for standing up, calling it out, holding governments and those charged with the responsibility for child protection to face up to it, to lobby for funding and for the necessary resources, and to support each other and collectively to have this discussion, which is starting now, develop and build. And while that might not be a specific answer to what can the law do and what more can be done, I think we need champions, and we need to get a little bit more of this cross-cutting initiative to draw expertise and talent to make the leaders of our Commonwealth nations sit up and hear properly and take notice. And I look forward to working with this group and with others as we try and make this voice heard very loudly, both at CHOGM and within law ministers' agendas and at Stephen's annual meeting of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association and within the Commonwealth Lawyers, to have a specific series of information webinars about the topic to inform and have those difficult and challenging conversations. So that's our challenge, Sarah, but we're up for it.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I think starting a conversation is what we're doing here. And through this conversation, we're raising awareness. And that is so, so important. And we are very grateful to have the support of the Commonwealth Lawyers Association in this area. So thank you so much. Shavana, what can Commonwealth governments do to advance the protection of children from these forms of violence? And how does your human rights unit at the Commonwealth Secretariat assist in this regard?
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that question. And just to sort of reiterate, it is really, really important to have this conversation. I'm really as Brian said, sort of inspired by having this conversation, and hopefully we can sort of further the conversation after this panel as well. And I'm sort of, in answering this question, I'm also going to, I suppose, repeat what some of the other panelists have already said. I think it's really necessary for governments to come together and collectively commit to tackling child sexual exploitation and abuse. And with this, naturally requires strong intelligence sharing between countries. Also, as I mentioned earlier, child exploitative practices can be very contextual and even regional in a way. So there is scope here to create regional platforms for neighbouring countries to share best practice, learn from one another, strengthen networks, etc. I think governments should first and foremost absolutely ensure that they're fulfilling their international obligations, and those were mentioned earlier. And in addition, having strong, really robust national human rights frameworks that, you know, are broadly strong, but also specifically tailored to protecting children from such exploitation. Now, there's been an emphasis on the law, and I absolutely do not deny that the legislation is so important. But I always also say that it's about implementation. I have seen that sometimes countries have very strong and good laws, and this is always very promising. But governments also need to ensure that this is applied within society at a really practical level. And this can include, as has been stated, awareness raising, education for the public. That would be at the school level, and definitely in some contexts, rural communities where access to justice is really difficult. And then, of course, for public agencies such as law enforcement as well, because enforcement tends to be a bit of a problem. So training and training the trainer in this regard, I think is very crucial. And this sort of links well with the second part of your question about what we do at the Human Rights Unit. So we take, as I said, a very contextual, holistic, and quite multi-sectoral approach to our work and to this very complex issue. We support our member countries in a way that really ensures impact and sustainability. So that is where our emphasis is at, you know, moving away from sort of short-term solutions, really focusing on that sort of longevity. This does include providing technical assistance, capacity building, and advocacy on issues such as child sexual exploitation and abuse. And we facilitate engagement with UN human rights bodies and special procedures on such issues. So, for example, we help countries with their treaty body reporting to the CRC and implementation of international instruments such as the Convention, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So Commonwealth countries are definitely not ignoring the issue, and some of the work that we're currently doing definitely sort of exemplifies that. We also recently conducted a study on child and early forced marriage, and we are continuously working with countries on establishing, and if already in existence, strengthening national human rights institutions. So again, there is sort of efforts there, initiatives happening, but I think what, for me, this discussion has shown is that there needs to be much more multi-stakeholder efforts. I am so inspired by what I'm hearing from the excellent panelists here today, and I'm really, and I can safely say that my unit feels the same, really looking forward to sort of working with the accredited organisations moving forward.
Wonderful, Siobhana, thank you so much. Stephen, what gaps do you think need to be addressed in order for parliamentarians as lawmakers to be able to make a difference?
Well, thanks very much, Sarah. I think the most important is political will. And I think the political will, not just to make the commitments that we've all talked about, but to then maintain that focus and sustain that priority. And I recall when in my former role at the International Development Committee, when we looked at this, we looked into some of the issues that had arisen around sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment in the aid and development sector, and realised that actually the evidence on this didn't go back years, it went back decades, and that there have been previous moments where reports have been published, concerns have been raised, but the focus hadn't been maintained. So I think crucially, maintaining that focus is vital, and the political will to do that is probably the key area where there will be a gap in many situations. Secondly is, I think, about knowledge and evidence and having the best awareness possible amongst parliamentarians. So that is about the best legal framework, as we've talked about. It's about the human rights dimension, which I think has rightly been emphasised, and it's about the responsibilities that people have, including people who are working with children and young people and other groups that are vulnerable. So a big role for us in the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association is about sharing best practice and promoting that amongst our members. So I look forward to the CommonProtect research project, because I think that good project reports, good research findings can really assist, both in terms of the legislation as it's developed, but also in terms of the other roles that parliamentarians have. I think the third gap I'd identify is really about the confidence to speak up and to feel equipped to speak up, particularly in some of the contexts that we've heard about from other members of the panel. This is about power, and so it's challenging the abuse of power. We know that children can be amongst the most vulnerable in society. We know also that there are other groups that will face particular discrimination in some countries, ethnic and religious minorities, LGBT communities, the poorest. Often it will be even harder for them to come forward if they have experienced exploitation, abuse, or harassment. And my final point is that parliamentarians should not be operating in a vacuum. So parliamentarians working with the lawyers, working with governments, but challenging them, but also crucially working with civil society and using the frameworks of human rights and the sustainable development goals that other panelists have talked about today. Because in the end, the only way we'll close the gap that you asked me about is people really working well together in partnership, and parliamentarians, I think, have a very important part to play in that partnership.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. And it is so encouraging to know that parliamentarians around the Commonwealth view children's protection as a priority area. Thank you. David, why do you feel that this is such an important issue in the Commonwealth?
Well, there are many reasons. I think one of the first ones that my colleagues have said so much that is, and that totally resonates with my experience and research, having done frontline social work practice as well some years ago. But the Commonwealth is a very permeable structure. There are lots of movements across borders between Commonwealth countries. And recent research by International Social Service UK, I'm a trustee of Children and Families Across Borders, showed that when families move out of the UK, in this case, it can take over a month for a child protection concern to be passed to another country. And that's where children are really seriously at risk. And most of our countries don't even collect that data. We don't even know how many children are moving across borders, and indeed how many children on child protection orders or on care orders in different countries are placed abroad with families. So there are all sorts of complex issues there that we need to think about and to work on. The second thing is that we know all across the Commonwealth, there's a tendency to say that if a young person is found to be involved in a sexual relationship, that it must be their fault and they are criminalised. And there are many young people in prison, children under 18, because they were involved in sexual relationships. This is very difficult for girls and for boys. And understanding across the Commonwealth that a young person who's caught in a sexual relationship is not to blame, is never to blame for that relationship. As Stephen says, it's the power of the adult involved that needs to be addressed. The third thing is that I think we have to be honest about the cultural discussions that we're having. The Commonwealth Foundation has had a very brave series of discussions about complex cultural issues across the Commonwealth. And we have to recognise that in raising this issue, we're challenging some traditional, one might even say indigenous in some cases, of values and beliefs. And in a world that is wanting to emphasise the importance of Indigenous culture and to respect Indigenous culture, sometimes to open up the discussion about where things need to change or different attitudes need to be developed is not easy. And we all feel uncomfortable about that, but we have to have those conversations. So I think across the Commonwealth, as others have said, there's always different contexts. There's always individual circumstances that need to be recognised, but we also see the value that we place on young people and children. And that's something that the Commonwealth can unite around. And finally, perhaps, some Commonwealth countries have not yet signed up to some of the Hague Conventions about protecting children that move across boundaries, particularly when their families are divided across boundaries. And that's something also that will be important to raise in CHOGM and heads of government and lawyers meetings, something that can be discussed, which would also protect children. But in the end, it's getting the conversation going and recognising that we all have responsibilities, and we can only protect children if we work together, because we think sexual abuse is a family issue, but now increasingly it is part of international crime. And we have to be able to deal with all of those issues, difficult as they are. So thank you for raising them, and we look forward to the report.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you very much, David, for your very powerful answer. Thank you. Sneh, we know that civil society organisations throughout the Commonwealth play an important role in protecting children. But in your experience, what is the role of civil society in addressing the exploitation of children? And can you tell us about the work of the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative to address contemporary forms of slavery and trafficking?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, it's been recognized already that government actions and legislative change alone are often not sufficient to address issues of child exploitation and abuse. And even if comprehensive laws are in place, implementation mechanisms can sometimes be weak, with laws not being enforced or not being monitored. And, you know, we've talked about the multi-stakeholder approach being very important here. And also this is where the role of civil society cannot be underestimated. So civil society has a vital role to play, also working with others, with government stakeholders, with parliamentarians, and with each other to address gaps in, for example, legislative and policy development. And this includes lobbying to ensure all forms of child exploitation and abuse is criminalized, that definitions are harmonized, as we've heard from other speakers, and that definitions are broad in scope. You know, monitoring and holding governments and businesses accountable is a very important function for civil society. Another area related to prosecution of such offenses is supporting survivors and their families to navigate often complex criminal justice systems, and also to push for child-friendly criminal justice processes. So civil society can also facilitate research that enhances the efficacy and accuracy of child protection mechanisms, as well as supporting training of law enforcement officials, prosecutors, and judges. In the area of prevention, there are many examples of education and awareness raising initiatives, and indeed community empowerment programs across the Commonwealth that aim to minimize risk factors related to the exploitation of children. For example, in the Gambia, the NGO Tostan supports the empowerment of women and adolescent girls through education on human rights, health, and democracy to bring about social change. Commonwealth governments have funded similar initiatives. For example, Australia has supported development programs across the Pacific to support women's empowerment, working with civil society on the ground. So programs like these help to address harmful cultural beliefs and attitudes which increase children's vulnerability to exploitation and abuse. And these efforts also work towards reducing the stigmatization that survivors often face. And just a point on collaboration and partnerships, that these are also very critical here. Some of the other speakers have touched on this as well, that international cooperation between states is incredibly important, in particular when the sale, trafficking, or sexual exploitation of children takes on a transnational character, but also to promote the sharing of resources, best practice and knowledge across countries. Addressing the issue of exploitation of children will require international cooperation frameworks to facilitate identification and trafficking and tracking of offenders, for example, as well as investigation and sharing of evidence, which can allow prosecutions to be brought and convictions obtained. On the issue of collaboration, one final point, it is also vital to sensitively include children survivors in our advocacy work and legislative formulation, or those that work directly with children, in order to ensure that our policies and strategies are survivor informed. It's quite critical to do this. Just very briefly, Sarah, on the last point of your question about what CHRI is doing in this area. Since 2016, the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative has urged all Commonwealth states to adhere to their commitments to achieve UN Sustainable Development Goal Target 8.7. We have a program on the eradication of contemporary forms of slavery that focuses on research, advocacy, network building, and capacity building. And in 2019, we launched the Commonwealth 8.7 Network, which is an international member-driven network with approximately 70 frontline civil society organizations that share a common vision to eradicate contemporary forms of slavery and human trafficking. And 20% of our network members directly work on issues related to child labor and child exploitation, with others working in areas that also impact on children. And the 8.7 Network serves as a knowledge sharing platform for country-specific and thematic issues and good practice. And they work, the network works collaboratively to raise awareness and advocate for changes to laws and policies. And I like Shavana's quote earlier, it takes a network to bring down a network. I think that collaboration and coalitions are vital in strengthening advocacy, as it allows for the amplification of voices, and it also ensures that policies and frameworks reflect and address the realities that are faced by individuals and communities.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. It really does take a network to bring down a network. And thank you also for the amazing work you do. Helen, as our time for this panel draws to a close, considering your years of experience in this area, what do you see as the next steps for the Commonwealth in working together to protect children from exploitation and abuse? Helen?
Thank you, Sarah. Sorry about that. Yes, I think this has been such a rich discussion that we've had, and to bring together various stakeholder groups and to have this discussion is just, I think, showing the power of the Commonwealth to move forward, but also emphasising that stakeholder, multi-stakeholder approach to this that has to happen now. I think we've had gaps in the Commonwealth in the past. Actually, there hasn't been a huge amount of focus on children's issues. Yes, in education that's come through, but there's been some gaps. And of course, I do also know that the Commonwealth has been working on early child marriage and FGM. But this issue now of child sexual exploitation and abuse, we need to drive forward as a bigger constituency. And this, I think, discussion has reflected that. Because it's a huge area, it needs lots and lots of partnerships. Now, one of the initiatives that's also happening in the Commonwealth recently is the formation of a child interest group. And I think that's going to be a mechanism to help pull Commonwealth organisations together in terms of working in the future on this issue. We need all sectors to be actually owning the issue. So I think it's been excellent to hear how the lawyers view their role, how the parliamentarians, the human rights activists and social workers moving forward. And we've need to have a good sense of what's needed on the ground. So that means us all engaging also with civil society. Clearly, with the launch of the report next month, I think that provides a resource for us all to use, to look at it with our different lenses in terms of our constituency groups, in terms of what the key messages are for our particular sectoral groups. and how we can address this issue, both at the national level, the regional level, and the pan-Commonwealth level. And I think the other key thing about the Commonwealth, which Shavana touched on, was this whole learning and sharing facility that exists, those strong networks. And I think the big question is what works and how can we share amongst each other, where countries are doing extremely well in terms of their legal frameworks, where others are doing well in terms of their implementation, but also to pull together what are the challenges that countries are particularly needing to focus on, and how can we use the experience of other Commonwealth countries on that. But I think this also needs a bit of marshalling. So this is where some sort of a call to action that basically brings us all together as different sectoral groups is going to be so essential. And I think this conversation during Commonwealth Week has really been an excellent platform for starting that and moving forward with the issue, not just for CHOGM, but of course the 2 years after and going forward, because this is an issue, sadly, that's going to be with us. It's been with us for a very long time, and it's going to be with us a long time in the future. But we do need to look at strategies to tackle this.
Yeah, we do. Thank you so much, Helen. Fantastic. So we've actually reached the end of today's panel, but we're so grateful to all of our panelists who have shared their insights and recommendations on this session. And, you know, it has been amazing to hear from you all as we work towards our shared goals together. Thank you as well to everyone who's joined us during this panel online, and to all of you who are watching. The full recording of this panel will be available on It's a Penalty social media, so you can rewatch at any time. So just to summarize, it is indeed both the responsibility of the individual state and the international community to protect children around the world from exploitation and abuse. And as a global problem, I think everyone can agree that it truly does require a global solution. Today, through our discussion, we have started to form a call to action, as Helen said, and we know that the Commonwealth can be an effective forum to prioritise and work together as a whole to address the protection of children from sexual exploitation and abuse. But presently, children under the age of 18 are not adequately represented in Commonwealth discussions, and their safety from these forms of violence needs to be more of a focus. So we encourage all Commonwealth governments to criminalise all forms of sexual offences against children and enact specific legislation and measures that result in children being protected and offenders prosecuted, and therefore abuse prevented. Commonwealth governments should have a framework implemented which supports skilled professionals in the protection system, including social workers, lawyers, healthcare, police, and parliamentarians, who have an incredibly important role to play in protecting children from these forms of violence. There are many international frameworks which Commonwealth governments can join in order to assist them making these steps, including the Council of Europe's Lanzarote Convention on Protection of Children Against Sexual Exploitation and Sexual Abuse, the We Protect Global Alliance, and the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children. The upcoming Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, CHOGM, provides an important opportunity to highlight these issues, particularly in relation to the impact of the pandemic for children and their increased vulnerability, and that's both online and offline. Together, which I think is the general message that we've received from this panel, that together we can build a Commonwealth where all children are protected from sexual exploitation and abuse. We can join together to CommonProtect. So thank you once again to our panelists, Brian, Shavana, Stephen, David, Sinead, and Helen, and to you, our audience. Do join us at the launch event of our CommonProtect research report on the 20th of April. And remember to sign up to the It's a Penalty mailing list at itsapenalty.org if you'd like to attend. Thank you so much.
Thank you.